Without discipline to bind them together, an army is little more than a disorderly mob, liable to flee at the first sign of danger. Yet such unquestioning obedience was instilled in men not only through indoctrination and rigorous training, but also under the looming threat of merciless punishment for any and all infractions of the rules. The long and often brutal list of punitive measures, ensuring compliance and cohesion within military units, and fostering a level of fear that made refusing to carry out orders an extremely risky proposition. For the vast majority of maritime history, discipline aboard a naval ship was harshly enforced. The list of penalties for infractions of the rules, long and varied in severity. However, perhaps the most feared punishment of all was the method that became known as marooning. Usually reserved for only the most severe transgressions, including mutiny or cowardice in battle, marooning involved stranding the guilty man on a remote island that was often little more than a temporary sandbank, or simply setting him adrift in the middle of the ocean on a small boat or raft. Allocated a meagre ration of supplies and a simple pistol, the condemned sailor stood virtually no chance of being rescued. His remaining few days of hopeless life spent contemplating his impending doom, as hunger, thirst, and exposure worked together to curse him with a slow, drawn-out, and lingering death, his only two options remaining to either endure the suffering that lay ahead, or swiftly end his own life with the pistol, which for the more religiously minded meant damning his eternal soul in the process. The life of a sailor has always been fraught with danger and hardship. Isolated from civilization and the support that comes with it, surrounded by an environment that was hostile to human life, and with food and water supplies limited in both quantity and quality, dozens or even perhaps hundreds of men found themselves cooped up with one another on what was little more than a floating wooden prison for months at a time. Hundreds of miles from land and surrounded by a vast ocean that was capable of snuffing out their lives at a moment's notice in its icy and smothering embrace, a ship's crew not only had to contend with the cruelty of Mother Nature, but also the possibility of enemy warships and pirates lurking behind every horizon. Faced with such arduous conditions, maintaining and enforcing discipline was paramount to the survival of all on board. The crew forced to live under the total control of the ship's captain, who assumed the role of God, this single man holding the power of life and death over his entire crew. Rules governed every aspect of life for the sailors under the captain's command. However, rules are only as sturdy as the punishments that enforce them, and rule breakers found themselves subject to a long and creatively varied list of punishments indeed. Depending on the severity of his transgression, a sailor could face everything from simply being clapped in irons and placed in the brig for a few days, all the way through to outright execution. Perhaps the most commonly used punishment was flogging, with usually between 12 to 24 lashes delivered against the bared back of a victim with some birch sticks as retribution for minor breaches of conduct, an ordeal that was extremely painful and unpleasant, but rarely deadly. Yet, should the sailor have committed a more serious crime, a horrific instrument of pain known as the cat of nine tails would be utilized for the flogging, a type of flail that usually contained 9 strands of rope or leather, the ends of each of the 9 cords affixed with heavy knots, fishhooks, or musket balls to inflict maximum pain and trauma upon the sailor's exposed flesh. The cat of nine tails would almost certainly inflict deep lacerations and severe bleeding, and occasionally even tear out chunks of flesh, the horrific wounds later doused with salt and vinegar to both prevent infection and magnify the level of pain. Throwing wrongdoers overboard to drown, selling them into slavery, repeatedly dunking them in the ocean while suspended from the yardarm, or simply a good old-fashioned hanging were other common punishments. Yet when it comes to inflicting suffering on others, man's creativity knows no bounds. The practice known as sweating involved the rest of the crew poking at the guilty sailor with their swords, daggers, or any other sharpened object, while he attempted to dodge their thrusts while tied to the mast with a rope, giving the appearance of him dancing around the mast while a fiddle played in the background. Keel hauling was another rare but often lethal punishment, which was unsettlingly creative in its design. The unfortunate victim would be tied to a rope, thrown overboard, and then hauled underneath the ship before being pulled up to safety on the other side. The punished sailor would not only have to contend with holding his breath in the icy water long enough to prevent drowning, but also with having his naked, exposed body dragged along the ship's barnacle-covered hull, these razor-sharp crustaceans glued to much of the ship's outer surface, lacerating his flesh as the sailor was dragged across them, the resulting horrific injuries inflicted often proving to be fatal. Yet of all these creatively cruel punishments, it was marooning that invoked the most fear and dread. Usually reserved for only the most heinous infractions of the rules, such as mutiny, stealing from other crew, abandoning one's post in battle, or outright desertion, those judged guilty would be abandoned on a raft or remote, uninhabited island, with just a small amount of food and water, as well as a pistol. Now completely alone and hundreds of miles from anyone who might rescue him, the doomed sailor knew that all that awaited him in the coming days was the excruciatingly slow process of death by dehydration, starvation, and exposure. The meagre rations he had been provided with, merely another tool to prolong his suffering, giving him additional time to contemplate the terror that lay ahead. The island or raft that the sailor was marooned on would become both his prison and his tomb, the knowledge that only a miracle would save him, undoubtedly crushing all hope as the condemned man fell into inescapable despair. With food and water rapidly diminishing with each passing day, no matter how strictly he rationed it, the sailor not only had to contend with the torture of starvation, but might also find himself eaten alive by wild animals or even another man, the brief comfort of being marooned with a companion rapidly descending into suspicion, paranoia, and fear, as extreme hunger and desperation made the man by your side increasingly gaze upon you with hungry eyes, the sight of your flesh growing more appetizing with each new dawn. Faced with such a cruel fate, a simple and swift hanging or bullet to the back of the head might have seemed like a luxurious mercy. However, in a more religious era, the ending of one's own life was considered a sin that would damn your soul for eternity. The loaded pistol the marooned sailor was usually provided with as a means to end things quickly, acting as the final twist in the unfortunate man's ordeal. Most lotteries divide participants into two camps, winners and losers. However, in the case of decimation, every man of a disgraced Roman cohort that was forced to draw lots faced two outcomes that were both harrowing in their brutality. The losers were mercilessly stoned, beaten and clubbed to death by the rest of their unit, while the so-called winners were duty-bound to rain down fatal blows upon the body and skull of a man who had likely been their friend and comrade in arms for years. This tight-knit group of warriors, who had shared many a campfire and hardships together, now forced to savagely beat the life out of a man that they had once called brother. Yet while this ordeal might seem unthinkable and even counterproductive to the modern mind, for the Romans such a ruthless punishment was absolutely necessary to maintain the legendary discipline her legions had cultivated over the centuries, discipline which had proved pivotal to Roman success in battle and directly resulted in much of the known world falling under her dominion. If this discipline were allowed to falter for even a moment, the entire empire would come crashing down. The Roman army was an incredibly effective war machine that created one of the largest empires in history. Yet what was it about this body of men that enabled them to best powerful foes in battle time and time again? While superior equipment, tactics, technology, courage and training certainly gave the Roman legions an enormous advantage over their enemies, it was their unbreakable discipline that truly set them apart, a discipline built upon a foundation of merciless punishment for even the most minor infraction of the rules. Such steely discipline was essential for cohorts of legionaries to maintain formation in the chaos of battle. The strength in unity derived from such formations only feasible so long as each individual soldier put aside the individual interests and acted as a collective, following orders without question and carrying out their duties to the letter. Any soldier whose discipline faltered had to be sternly punished, lest his failures infect the entire unit. The negligence or cowardice of just one man, capable of undermining the fighting ability of an entire unit and even an entire army. Failure to snuff out even the slightest lapse in discipline might encourage others to allow their standards to slip, thus harming overall morale, and in a time where mercy and weakness could simply not be tolerated, harsh reprisals levied against the guilty acted as a powerful deterrent to cowardice, insubordination, negligence, and all other qualities considered antithetic to the ideal Roman character. While the Romans admired and fostered the ideals of bravery and heroism in young men, military commanders knew full well that courage alone could not be relied upon in the heat of battle. The subsequent unforgiving enforcement of the rules considered crucial if Roman strength was to be maintained. A wide range of penalties were utilized for this purpose, with conventional punishments such as demotion, hard labor, dishonorable discharge, ration reductions, beatings, and fines levied to maintain standards amongst the rank and file. However, for soldiers who showed cowardice in battle, deserted their posts, lied under oath, or stole from other soldiers, no mercy could be shown, the men responsible considered irreparably tarnished. Such men would be sentenced to what was known as fustuarium, an execution method which involved the guilty party being slowly beaten to death with wooden clubs by his comrades. In these situations, no trial would be held, a guilty verdict instead issued on the sole authority of the commanding officer. There would be no appeals, pleading for mercy, or clemency shown. The sentence would be carried out with 100% certainty. The condemned soldier would first be stripped naked, a form of humiliation that deprived the doomed man of any status he once held. He was then encircled by a group of club-wielding soldiers who would have likely been drawn from the same cohort. Upon the overseeing officer's command, the men would have begun raining down blows upon the victim's exposed body with the weighty clubs, the deadly beating carried out with great care to avoid hitting the head, thus ensuring that the pain and suffering was prolonged for as long as possible. The entire ordeal carried out in full view of the rest of the soldiers in the victim's cohort. This drawn-out, terrifying execution reminding those watching of the fate that would await them if they too failed to do their Roman duty. Such was the dread that the fustuarium inspired amongst the Roman legions that it said that men who had lost their weapons on the battlefield would often hurl themselves at the enemy in the hopes of either recovering their blade or receiving a quick death. This relatively merciful end, far preferable than the disgrace and suffering they would experience from fustuarium should they dare leave their weapons behind and flee. Faced with such a certain punishment from their own side, Roman soldiers would more often than not choose to stand and die rather than retreat, fighting to the last man no matter how terrible the odds they faced. Yet perhaps an even more terrible form of fustuarium was the punishment known as decimation. Usually reserved for instances where an entire cohort or legion had disgraced themselves, and thus simply executing every man would have been too wasteful and counterproductive. A condemned unit could wash away the collective guilt and shame with the sacrificial blood of an unlucky chosen few. In these rare cases where an entire legion or cohort had fled from battle, deserted their posts, or even mutinied, every single man from that unit would be forced to partake in a lottery, regardless of his individual actions, rank, or social status. All of the accused men would be divided into groups of 10 and forced to draw lots, with the one soldier in every group of 10 upon whom the lot fell condemned to a savage and lethal beating at the hands of the remaining 9. With stones, clubs, and fists, the Chosen One would slowly have the life beaten out of him by 9 men whom he had likely lived and fought side by side with for several years. The pain and suffering he experienced during the last moments of his life only matched by the mental trauma of the 9 men carrying out the grisly sentence. These so-called lucky survivors subsequently exiled from the main camp, where they were forced to sleep outside and sustain themselves with rations of barley instead of wheat until it was considered that their penance had been completed. Yet why did the condemned soldiers willingly obey such a vicious and cruel command when they vastly outnumbered their officers and could have easily mutinied? Surprisingly, decimation may have actually been considered to be a positive and even merciful outcome, whereby the surviving 90% of a unit were generously offered a murderous path to redemption. The collective acceptance of guilt, along with the burden of carrying out the punishment, offering a way for them to eventually be reintegrated into the army, the shame washed away with the blood of 10% of their number, the stain on their reputation purified by the purging of sacrificial scapegoats. Although rare, there are several recorded accounts of decimation being used as a punishment. The earliest is thought to have occurred in 471 BC, when Consul Appius Claudius Sabinus ordered that his army be decimated after his men fled from battle, while Marcus Crassus resurrected the practice 400 years later during the Third Servile War against the rebellious slave Spartacus, when 2 of his legions disobeyed his direct orders not to engage the enemy, a decision which led to their defeat in battle and punishment by decimation for their costly disobedience. Yet it wasn't just the Romans who utilized decimation to maintain discipline within the ranks of their armies. During the 30 Years' War, a 900-man strong imperial cavalry unit of the Holy Roman Empire was decimated by hanging on the orders of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm in 1642 after their retreat in the face of the enemy resulted in the loss of an entire battle, and the practice was even used as recently as 1866 by Paraguay after the 10th Battalion fled without firing a shot during the Battle of Curuzu, and was thus sentenced to decimation by firing squad. While in the 20th century, Trotsky is said to have used decimation against deserters during the Russian Civil War. France decimated a company of Tunisian colonial soldiers who refused an order to attack in 1914. And the Italian general Luigi Cadorna used decimation against underperforming Italian troops on several occasions during the First World War, disturbing examples that show that this ancient punishment will likely be used once again at some point in the future. Faced with the chaos and carnage of a live battle, military commanders have always wrestled with the natural survival instincts of men, which often urge them to flee from danger rather than face it head-on. Yet while a variety of training techniques, inspirational speeches, punishments, and rewards have been experimented with over the centuries, one of the most callously simple but effective ways to stop soldiers from fleeing in panic was to simply make them aware that doing so would result in an immediate and assured death, thus making retreat the worst option for a terrified man looking for the best way to survive. Known as barrier troops or anti-retreat forces, these specially trained, well-equipped and more importantly highly loyal units were placed at the rear of the main force with orders to identify and, if needed, eliminate anyone attempting to shirk the so-called patriotic duty by fleeing, and although in many cases they simply returned temporarily wavering soldiers back to the front lines, they were empowered to, and often did, open fire on their own side if their demands went unheeded. Perhaps the most infamous example of large-scale use of barrier troops occurred during the Second World War. With the invasion of the Soviet Union proceeding at a lightning pace, there seemed to be no way to slow down the unrelenting advance of the juggernaut that was the German war machine. As the invasion's momentum grew, millions of Soviet troops found themselves taken prisoner, with millions more retreating in panic or simply outright deserting as the entire Soviet army appeared on the brink of collapse. Desperate to halt this dangerously rapid loss of territory and stave off the total collapse of the Soviet Union, In August of 1941, Stalin issued Order No. 270, directing the Red Army to fight to the last, banning military commanders from surrendering, and levying severe penalties against anyone found to be deserting or shirking away from their patriotic duty. From now on, anyone who surrendered or retreated in the face of the enemy would be considered a traitor and enemy of the Soviet people. A year later, this proclamation was followed up with Order No. 227, now famously known as the "Not One Step Back" rule, a desperate attempt at resurrecting discipline in the troops, which decreed that all found to be guilty of cowardice were to be liquidated on the spot. The order authorized the army to create units of barrier troops known as blocking detachments, which would be placed at the rear of the main Soviet army with orders to open fire on anyone considered to be a panic monger and coward. This threat of summary execution was intended to restore discipline in a body of men who had suffered months of almost unending defeat, with the Soviet military leadership now well aware of how even just a handful of men panicking could spread through an entire unit, this ripple effect causing a mass retreat and adding yet another loss to the rapidly growing list of defeats. The Soviet security forces known as the NKVD were already deployed at strategic points throughout the country, tasked with catching deserters and spies, as well as investigating traitors, reports of self-inflicted wounds and sabotage, and interrogating military and civilian personnel who were returning from enemy captivity. However, following Order No. 227, they were now tasked with preventing and punishing any and all cases of unauthorized retreat within the Red Army, and as the war progressed, special Red Army detachments of barrier troops were also created to deal with the growing problem of desertion, disobedience, and dereliction of duty. Any soldier attempting to retreat without orders, or even merely failing to advance against the enemy during an attack, would find themselves encountering the unforgiving men of the blocking detachments, these dedicated and unwaveringly loyal soldiers prepared to do whatever it takes to prevent a small number of men retreating turning into a full-on rout. Yet while for many the image of Soviet barrier troops involves lines of cruel zealots machine gunning their own side, the reality was that opening fire on the men retreating was a relatively rare last resort, only utilized when every other tactic had failed. Instead, the blocking detachments would first attempt to persuade the men fleeing from their positions to return to the front, well aware that large numbers of the young, untrained, and thus unreliable soldiers simply required a firm hand to restore their resolve, thus negating the need for wasteful mass executions. The barrier troops instead focused their efforts on identifying and dealing with the much smaller number of dangerous ring leaders, the so-called cowards and panic mongers whose defeatism and fear could easily spread through an entire army and pull others back with them, potentially cascading into a full-scale retreat. Those considered to be ringleaders were usually shot immediately, this decisive move nullifying their influence on the rest of the group, while also serving as a visible example of what would happen to the rest of the men if they refused to turn back. The elimination of those who had instigated a retreat was usually enough to suppress panic and return the remaining soldiers back to the front lines. With the memory of what would happen to them if they dared to retreat again still fresh in their minds, the bulk of the Soviet troops were left with no option other than to advance into battle against the enemy no matter the odds. Exactly how many men fell victim to the barrier troops is unknown, however some estimates put the number killed as high as 150,000, with potentially millions more arrested or stopped and returned to the front lines. Yet while the concept of barrier troops is closely associated with the Soviet Union during the Second World War, their use was actually nothing new, with armies around the world throughout history likely to have utilized some form of rear line of men designed to discourage those at the front from running from a fight. Other well-documented examples include the Red Army during World War I, when Trotsky authorized the use of barrier troops against unreliable regiments of the First Red Army, and the National Revolutionary Army of the Republic of China during the Battle of Nanking in the Second Sino-Japanese War, when a battalion of the 36th Division guarding the Yijiang Gate was under orders to let no one through, orders which they mercilessly carried out on December 12, 1937, when other Chinese units fell back and retreated without permission in the face of a Japanese attack, and were fired upon by their own side's barrier troops, inflicting multiple fatalities. In times of war, how does a military commander ensure that each one of the thousands of individuals under his command acts in the best interests of the greater good, especially when doing so will often go against his own personal well-being and natural drive for self-preservation? For the Mongols under the legendary conqueror Genghis Khan, such a conundrum had a simple but ruthlessly effective solution. If you wish to stop one man from fleeing in the face of danger, you merely have to ensure that he is aware that he not only forfeits his own life by disobeying orders, but also the lives of the rest of the men in his unit. This collective guilt for the sins of an individual, ensuring that the rank-and-file soldiers of a given formation were bound to one another with near unbreakable ties of loyalty. In the heat of battle, a wavering soldier knew full well that running away and abandoning men whom he had likely come to see as friends and brothers would see them swiftly condemned and executed by their own side when the battle had ended, this terrible knowledge placing steel in his spine and motivating him to stand and fight, no matter the personal cost. The incredible Mongol conquests of the 13th and 14th centuries were no accident of fate. For such a relatively small tribe of unsophisticated horsemen to overcome the advanced superpowers of their time required a special combination of tactics, technology, diplomacy, espionage, and terror, deployed with ruthless efficiency by talented leaders who were unwaveringly obedient and loyal to the Mongol Khan. Yet such incredible military victories also required a level of iron discipline that most commanders could only dream of wielding. If enemy armies many times their size were to be vanquished, it was essential for the Mongol troops to work together in almost perfect unity. Their famed battlefield maneuvers, such as the feigned retreat, only possible so long as every individual soldier acted in a tightly coordinated and precise manner. Such incredible discipline among the men of the rank and file was forged with a combination of generous rewards and equally harsh punishments. Warriors were promoted based on merit rather than social status, and all plunder was distributed fairly, the process even overseen by a dedicated body known as the Jagu. However, just as the men were bountifully rewarded for success and obedience, they were also subjected to swift and severe punishments for disloyalty and cowardice. Any soldier who disobeyed orders would be immediately punished. Depending on the severity of his transgression, the wrongdoer might find himself merely whipped or fined, with the death penalty handed out to deserters, those who retreated without orders, and anyone found sleeping on sentry duty. The fear these extreme punishments inspired, ensuring that acts of disobedience and dereliction of duty within the Mongol ranks were extremely rare indeed. Yet perhaps the most unusual, severe, and at the same time effective punishment was one which placed the responsibility and guilt for a soldier's dishonourable actions at not only his own feet, but also the feet of the men he lived and fought with. The Mongol army was split into units of 10,000 men, with each group of 10,000 divided into 10 units of 1,000, each group of 1,000 divided into 10 units of 100, and each unit of 100 divided into 10 units of 10 men, known as an arban. It would be within this arban, the smallest unit of the Mongol army, that this collective guilt would be mercilessly enforced. The 10 men within an arban trained, lived and fought together from the moment they entered military service, their wider families accompanying them on campaign and responsible for supplying them with arrows and food. This tight-knit group of individuals, forging unbreakable bonds of loyalty through shared hardships and years spent in each other's company. These new mini-societies replacing the old tribal ties of the past. It is thus understandable that any betrayal of one's Arben was considered a heinous violation of the natural order, staining the memory of the individual responsible with eternal shame, disdain, and dishonor. Such solid bonds were expertly exploited by Mongol commanders in their pursuit of military discipline. The members of an Arben considered collectively responsible for one another and thus liable for punishment should just one of the 10 men fail to perform his duties. If a soldier unknowingly dropped his bow, the man behind him would be punished if he failed to retrieve it. If one soldier fled from battle, all 10 members of an Arben would be put to death, regardless of their individual actions. If one man was captured by the enemy and the other 9 failed to rescue him, again the entire Arben would be put to death. Yet it was not only outright cowardice and dereliction of duty that was collectively punished, but also failure to match the daring and courage of others. If one or more of the Arben impetuously charged forward against the enemy in battle, any members of the Arben who failed to follow and support the impromptu attack would also be put to death. While such collective guilt and punishment might seem overly harsh and downright unfair, it's difficult to argue with the results of such a policy. Desertion and disobedience were virtually unheard of in the Mongol army during this period, with generals frequently entrusted with the command of tens of thousands of men as they operated with a great degree of freedom hundreds of miles away from home, the Mongol Khan confident that they would return to him even as they accumulated the kind of wealth, fame and power that often led to other medieval-era commanders declaring their independence and forming their own rebel fiefdoms. The enemies of the Mongols often remarked on the willingness of the rank-and-file Mongol soldier to endure any hardship he encountered. His unbreakable loyalty to the Arben, coupled with the threat against the lives of men who were practically family, ensuring that Mongol warriors almost never fled in the face of the enemy. When simply taking someone's life was not enough of a deterrent to be effective, incredibly cruel and unusual punishments had to be conjured up in the minds of authorities to deal with those under their command who refused to follow the rules. One of the most infamous of these creatively cruel punishments was known as lingchi, or death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, lingering execution that was so terrible and feared that, in comparison, a quick death would seem like a merciful blessing. For over 1,000 years, those convicted of the most heinous crimes in China would slowly have small portions of flesh carved away until they eventually succumbed to death. This extreme form of capital punishment not only tormenting the physical body, but also the spiritual soul, preying upon the Chinese belief that such mortal dismemberment would remain present in the afterlife, thus preventing the spirit from ever being whole again. For much of history, China has been a vast, wealthy, powerful, and populous empire. However, with such power and riches for the taking, there have always existed men who were prepared to betray and overturn the established order for their own gain. One of the main threats to stability came from the very men who were tasked with its preservation, the ambitious military commanders and civilian bureaucrats who over time amassed great personal power thanks to the armies and wealth they had been granted temporary control of. The temptation to rebel against their superiors and form their own fiefdoms, often simply too great for many to resist, as over the centuries rebellions and betrayals threatened to tear the country apart, and often succeeded in doing so. To deter such treachery, there had to exist punishments that matched the severity of the crime with equally severe brutality. The prospect of a torturous death potentially making would-be rebels think twice before betraying their oath, a harsh but necessary technique to maintain obedience within the officer class of the army. The Chinese legal code had long administered punishments which varied depending on the crime, with a range of punishments at a judge's disposal, including simple flogging, the amputation of nose or feet, exile, tattooing, and monetary fines. Death was reserved for the most serious offences. However, even executions existed on a sliding scale of torment, depending on the severity of a crime. The more abhorrent a crime, the more suffering involved in the execution. The main 4 forms of death penalty were the complete destruction of the body, including grinding the bones to dust so that not a hair remains, death by strangulation, death by decapitation, and what was known as lynching. Perhaps the severest form of punishment, lynching involved the dismemberment of a criminal while they were still alive, the condemned forced to endure the unbelievable agony of having their bodies slowly carved into pieces with a blade. Generally reserved for traitors, rebels, corrupt officials, enemies of the emperor, and anyone deemed a threat to the established order, those sentenced to lynching would first be tied to a wooden post while a large crowd assembled around them, the shocking spectacle about to unfold intended to be witnessed by as many people as possible to ensure maximum effectiveness as a deterrent. The executioner would then proceed to slowly and expertly carve small chunks of skin and flesh from the victim's exposed body, usually starting with the limbs and chest, methodically removing the skin, fat, and muscle tissue, with great care to ensure that the victim remained alive and conscious for as long as possible, thus maximizing his suffering and the psychological effect his ordeal might have on the watching crowd. With the victim's ribs exposed, the executioner would then move on to the arms, repeating the gruesome process once again before finally casting his attention on the legs. The man performing this human butchery was likely pressured to make as many cuts, incisions, and slices as possible without killing the victim, and some reports speak of the condemned enduring thousands of cuts spread across many hours before finally succumbing to death. While the entire aim of lynching was to inflict as much suffering as possible, the length and extent of the ordeal would often depend not only upon the executioner's skill, but also the wealth of the victim's family. A generous bribe often all that was needed for a killing blow to be delivered relatively early on, much to the watching crowd's dismay. Some accounts of the process indicate that opium was frequently administered to the victim. However, whether this was intended to help relieve the pain or simply prolong the suffering is unknown. Yet even with the victim's eventual death, the punishment was far from over. The lifeless corpse would ultimately be completely dismembered and placed in a basket, this final humiliation serving to ensure that even in the afterlife the punishment continued, for it was widely believed that altering the physical body violated the principle of filial piety, the belief that the body was something to be grateful for and was an extension of one's parents and should therefore not be damaged or altered in any way. The dismemberment not only violating this code, but also ensuring that the victim would enter the spiritual world in pieces rather than as a whole being, their mortal crimes thus receiving eternal damnation. So those are my choices for 5 ways military discipline has been maintained throughout history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.